The sun was setting over the small town of Riverdale, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement of the old gas station at the edge of town. Eddie's Gas and Go had seen better days, but it remained one of the few places where Thomas could find a moment's peace. Thomas Coleman sat on the curb near the air pump, his weathered hands carefully counting the few coins he had collected that day. At 58, his face told the story of a hard life, deep lines around his eyes, a gray beard that hadn't seen proper grooming in months, and a permanent squint from years spent outdoors. Most people in town simply knew him as the homeless guy who wandered between the gas station, the library, and the park. What they didn't know was that behind those tired eyes lay a different story entirely. Thomas arranged his few possessions neatly beside him, a worn military-style backpack, a plastic water bottle, and a cardboard sign that read Veteran. Any help appreciated. The evening was quiet, with only the occasional car stopping for gas. The young attendant inside, Joey, would sometimes bring Thomas a cup of coffee or leftover sandwiches when his manager wasn't looking. Another day, another dollar, Thomas mumbled to himself, tucking the coins into a small zippered pocket. He had nearly enough for a hot meal at the diner down the street. The peaceful evening was suddenly shattered by the roar of motorcycle engines. 5 bikes pulled into the gas station, their riders laughing loudly as they parked near the pumps. They wore leather vests with a logo Thomas couldn't quite make out, a local motorcycle club that had been causing trouble in town lately. "Hey boys, look what we got here," called out the largest of the group, a heavy-set man with a shaved head and arms covered in tattoos. "Seems like we found ourselves the local bum." Thomas lowered his head, hoping they would just get their gas and leave. He had learned long ago that invisibility was often his best defense. The bikers, however, had other plans. They surrounded Thomas, the shadows falling over him as the largest one, clearly their leader, stepped forward. "This is our gas station now, old man," he said, kicking at Thomas's backpack. "We don't like sharing our space with trash." Inside the store, Joey watched nervously, his hand hovering over the phone, unsure if he should call the police yet. "I don't want any trouble," Thomas said quietly, his voice surprisingly steady. "I'll just move along." As he reached for his backpack, one of the bikers snatched it away, laughing. "What you got in here, old-timer? Bottles? Cans? Your life savings?" The biker unzipped the bag and started throwing Thomas's few possessions onto the ground. A change of clothes, a small first aid kit, a tattered photo. When the photo hit the pavement, something changed in Thomas's demeanor. His shoulders straightened almost imperceptibly, his eyes, previously downcast, now locked onto the biker holding his bag. "Please return my property," Thomas said, his voice different now, clear, commanding, with a tone that made Joey look up sharply from behind the counter. The bikers just laughed harder. "Or what, Grandpa? You gonna fight all of us?" The leader stepped closer, towering over Thomas, who remained seated on the curb. "Stand up when I'm talking to you," he demanded, reaching down to grab Thomas by his jacket. In that moment, Joey saw something he would later struggle to describe to the police. Thomas moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his age. His hand caught the biker's wrist before it touched his jacket. The leader's confident smile faltered as he found he couldn't pull his arm away from Thomas's grip. And in the fading light of the gas station, Thomas Coleman slowly stood up. The gas station fell silent as Thomas stood up. His full height surprised everyone. He was taller than expected, standing eye to eye with the biker leader. Thomas still held the man's wrist in a grip that made the biker's fingers start to turn white. "Let go of me, you crazy old man," the leader shouted, trying to mask his surprise with anger. He yanked his arm, but Thomas held firm. "I asked you to return my property," Thomas said calmly, as if they were having a normal conversation. "I don't want trouble, but that photo is important to me." The other 4 bikers moved closer, forming a tight circle around Thomas. One of them, a skinny man with a long beard, laughed nervously. "Boss, you gonna let this bum talk to you like that?" he asked, pulling out a small knife from his pocket. The metal blade caught the glow of the gas station lights. Thomas finally released the leader's wrist with a slight push that made the big man stumble back a step. The action was small but calculated, making the other bikers pause. "5 against 1, Thomas said, shaking his head slowly. "Is that how you handle things?" The leader rubbed his wrist, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "You're about to find out exactly how we handle things," he growled. Inside the store, Joey finally made the call to the police. "There's about to be a fight at Eddie's Gas and Go," he whispered urgently. "5 bikers against a homeless man. Please hurry." Back outside, the skinny biker with the knife moved forward first. He slashed the air between them, trying to scare Thomas. "Not so tough now, are you?" Thomas stood perfectly still, his eyes tracking the knife's movement. When the biker lunged forward, Thomas stepped aside with surprising speed. The movement was so smooth that the biker stumbled past him, thrown off balance by his own momentum. Before anyone could react, Thomas grabbed the man's wrist and twisted it slightly. The knife clattered to the ground. Thomas kicked it under a nearby car, out of reach. "What the hell?" one of the other bikers muttered. "Who is this guy?" The leader wasn't waiting to find out. He charged at Thomas, throwing a heavy punch aimed at his face. Thomas ducked under it easily, like he was following steps in a dance he knew by heart. As the leader's momentum carried him forward, Thomas placed a firm hand on his back and pushed, not hard, but at exactly the right moment. The biker leader crashed into the gas pump, cursing loudly as pain shot through his shoulder. 2 more bikers rushed Thomas from different sides. Thomas moved between them, causing them to crash into each other. The confusion was clear on their faces. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. The 4th biker, who had been hanging back and watching, suddenly recognized something in Thomas's movements. His eyes widened. "Wait, guys," he called out. "I don't think." But the leader wasn't listening. Embarrassed and furious, he pulled himself up from the ground and reached into his jacket. The flash of metal revealed a larger knife. "You're dead, old man," he shouted. Just then, Thomas's foot connected with the photo that had been thrown on the ground. He glanced down for just a second, and in that moment of distraction, the leader lunged forward with his knife. Joey watched in horror from the store window, certain he was about to witness a murder. But instead, he saw Thomas move like water around the attack. He grabbed the leader's arm and turned, using the bigger man's weight against him. The biker flew through the air and landed hard on his back, the wind knocked out of him. The knife now rested in Thomas's hand. Everyone froze. Even the fallen leader stopped struggling when he saw his own knife pointing down at him. Who are you?" the 4th biker asked, his voice shaking. Thomas didn't answer immediately. He bent down, picked up the photo, and carefully tucked it into his pocket. Only then did he look up at the remaining bikers. "Someone you shouldn't have bothered," he said simply. In the distance, police sirens began to wail. The police sirens grew louder as Thomas stood calmly holding the knife. The 4 bikers who could still stand looked at each other nervously, unsure what to do next. Their leader remained on the ground, staring up at Thomas with a mixture of anger and fear. "You should go," Thomas said quietly, lowering the knife. "The police won't understand what happened here. They'll just see your club patches and make assumptions." The 4th biker, who had tried to warn the others earlier, stepped forward cautiously. He was older than the rest, with gray streaking through his beard. "Who are you, man?" he asked again. "Those moves? You're military, aren't you?" Thomas didn't answer directly. Instead, he flipped the knife in his hand and offered it back to the leader, handle first. "Take your friends and leave. No need for anyone to get arrested tonight." The leader hesitated, then snatched the knife and scrambled to his feet. His pride was clearly hurt worse than his body. "This isn't over," he growled, though with less conviction than before. "It is over," Thomas replied, his voice carrying a weight of authority that made even the leader pause. "Unless you want it to continue, but I don't think you do." The wailing sirens were just a few blocks away now. The bikers looked at each other, then at their bikes. "Let's go," the older biker said. "The old man's right. We don't need trouble with the cops." Reluctantly, the group moved toward their motorcycles. The leader shot one last dirty look at Thomas before climbing onto his bike. With engines roaring, they sped away just as the police car turned into the gas station lot. 2 officers stepped out, looking confused as they saw only Thomas standing there, picking up his scattered belongings. "Where are the bikers?" one officer asked Joey, who had come outside once he saw the police arrive. "They just left," Joey explained, pointing in the direction the motorcycles had gone. This man was defending himself. They were harassing him, threw his stuff everywhere. He didn't do anything wrong. The officers turned their attention to Thomas, who was quietly placing his belongings back into his backpack. "Sir, are you okay?" the younger officer asked. "Did they hurt you?" Thomas shook his head. "I'm fine, thank you." The older officer studied Thomas carefully. "You handled 5 bikers by yourself, without getting hurt?" Thomas shrugged. "They were mostly just showing off, not serious fighters." Something about the way Thomas spoke caught the older officer's attention. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You're not just any homeless person, are you, sir?" Thomas zipped up his backpack and straightened up. For the first time, the officer noticed how Thomas carried himself, shoulders back, head high, feet planted firmly despite his worn-out boots. "We all have our stories," Thomas said simply. The officer nodded slowly. "My father was military. I recognize the bearing. Mind if I ask where you served?" For a moment, Thomas seemed to debate whether to answer. Finally, he said, "Many places. Long time ago." "Would you like to press charges against those men?" the younger officer asked, notebook in hand. "We could try to track them down." Thomas shook his head. "No need. I think they learned something tonight." As the officers took statements from Joey about what happened, the older officer noticed Thomas carefully examining the photo he had picked up earlier. Curiosity got the better of him. "Someone important?" he asked, gesturing to the photo. Thomas hesitated, then turned the photo so the officer could see. It showed a younger Thomas in military uniform, standing with a woman and a teenage boy, all smiling. The officer noticed medals on Thomas's chest in the picture, not ordinary service medals. "My family," Thomas said quietly, before things changed. The officer wanted to ask more questions, but something in Thomas's expression stopped him. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "Listen, there's a veterans center downtown. Good people there. They might be able to help, if you're interested." Thomas took the card with a nod. "I appreciate it, officer." "Davis, James Davis." The officer extended his hand. "My father was Army, 10th Mountain Division." Thomas shook his hand firmly. "Good unit." As the police finished taking statements, Officer Davis pulled his partner aside. "That man isn't just some random homeless veteran," he whispered. "Did you see that photo? The medals?" "What about them?" his partner asked. Davis shook his head. "Those weren't regular service medals. One of them looked like a silver star, maybe even a Distinguished Service Cross." Both officers looked at Thomas, who was now sitting quietly back on his curb, the gas station returning to its evening calm. "Whoever he is," Davis said, "those bikers picked the wrong man to mess with tonight." The next morning, Thomas woke up in his usual spot behind the old community center. The events at the gas station had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. It had been years since he'd needed to use his training like that. He sat up slowly, his back stiff from sleeping on the hard ground. As he organized his few possessions, Thomas found the card Officer Davis had given him. Riverdale Veterans Support Center. He turned it over in his hands, considering it for a moment before tucking it away. Thomas made his way to the small creek behind the building to wash up. As he splashed cold water on his face, he heard the rumble of a motorcycle approaching. His body tensed immediately, ready for trouble. The motorcycle stopped nearby. Thomas stood up, preparing himself for a possible confrontation. To his surprise, it was the older biker from the night before, the one who had recognized his military background. He was alone. "Morning," the biker said, keeping a respectful distance. "Figured I might find you around here." Thomas said nothing, studying the man carefully. The biker was in his 50s, with a weathered face and the confident posture of someone who had seen his share of fights. "Name's Mike," the biker said. "Mike Danvers. I wanted to apologize for last night. Those young idiots I ride with, they don't know any better." Thomas remained silent, his eyes never leaving the man. "I served too," Mike continued. "Marines, 2 tours in Iraq. I know the look. The way you moved last night." He shook his head in admiration. "Special Forces." After a long moment, Thomas finally spoke. "Green Berets. A long time ago." Mike nodded. "Thought so. Listen, I'm not here to cause trouble. Actually, I brought you something." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a paper bag. "Breakfast and some coffee." He placed the bag on a nearby bench and stepped back, The gesture was clear. He wasn't trying to get too close or make Thomas uncomfortable. Thomas approached cautiously and checked the bag. Inside were 2 breakfast sandwiches and a large cup of coffee. "Why?" Thomas asked. Mike sighed. "Because what happened last night wasn't right, and because we vets should look out for each other." He paused. "Besides, I've been where you are." This caught Thomas's attention. "What do you mean?" 3 years after I got back from my second tour, I was living under a bridge," Mike explained. "PTSD, couldn't hold a job, wife left me, the whole disaster." Thomas took a sandwich from the bag and offered the other to Mike. "What changed?" Mike accepted the sandwich with a nod of thanks. "Someone found me. Another Marine. He dragged my sorry ass to the VA, got me into a program. It wasn't easy, but it helped." They ate in silence for a few minutes. "The guys from last night," Thomas finally said. "They your friends?" Mike shook his head. "Not really. They're from a newer chapter of the club. I ride with them sometimes because, well, it's better than being alone with my thoughts." Thomas understood that feeling all too well. "They won't bother you again," I continued. "I made sure of that, told them exactly who they were messing with." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "And who's that?" "I don't know your full story," Mike admitted. "But those moves last night, the way you handled 5 guys without breaking a sweat, you're definitely someone they should stay clear of." As they finished eating, Mike pulled something else from his jacket pocket, a small flip phone. "It's prepaid. Got minutes for about 3 months," he said, placing it on the bench. "My number's programmed in, if you ever need anything." He let the offer hang in the air. Thomas stared at the phone. It had been years since he had a way to contact anyone. "There are programs that can help," Mike said. "The VA's better than it used to be, and that veterans center in town. They're good people." Thomas thought about the card in his pocket. "Why are you doing this?" he asked. "You don't know me." Mike swung his leg back over his motorcycle. "Like I said, vets look out for each other. Or at least we should." He started the engine. "That phone's yours whether you call or not. But I hope you do." As Mike rode away, Thomas picked up the phone, turning it over in his hands. For the first time in years, he felt a connection to someone. A tiny thread pulling him back toward the world he had left behind. 3 days passed since Thomas met with Mike. The small flip phone remained untouched in his backpack. Each time Thomas thought about using it, something held him back. Years of isolation had built walls that weren't easy to break down. It was early afternoon when Thomas found himself back at Eddie's Gas and Go. Joey, the young attendant, waved at him through the window. Since the incident with the bikers, Joey had been friendlier than ever, often saving food for Thomas when he could. "Hey, Mr. Thomas," Joey called out as Thomas approached. "Got some leftover sandwiches from yesterday. Still good." Thomas nodded his thanks and accepted the food. As he sat down at his usual spot, he noticed a black SUV pull into the station. 2 men in plain clothes stepped out, their eyes scanning the area until they spotted Thomas. Something about their posture instantly put Thomas on alert. These weren't ordinary civilians. They moved with the deliberate efficiency he recognized from his military days. The taller man approached first, keeping his hands visible. "Thomas Coleman?" Thomas tensed. It had been years since anyone had called him by his full name. "Who's asking?" Thomas replied, his voice calm despite the alarm bells ringing in his head. "My name is Director James Wilson," the man said. "This is my colleague, Agent Ramirez. We're with the Defense Intelligence Agency." Thomas's expression didn't change, but his mind was racing. How had they found him? Why now, after all these years? "We've been looking for you for quite some time, Master Sergeant Coleman," Wilson continued. Joey, who was sweeping nearby, stopped to stare. "Master Sergeant," he repeated, looking at Thomas with new eyes. Thomas stood up slowly. "I haven't been Master Sergeant Coleman for a long time." Wilson nodded. "We're aware of your situation. May we speak privately?" Thomas glanced at Joey, who was still watching with wide eyes. "It's okay, Joey. I'll be back." The 3 men walked to a quiet corner of the parking lot, out of earshot from others. "How did you find me?" Thomas asked. Agent Ramirez spoke for the first time. "The incident with the bikers. Local police report mentioned a homeless veteran with unusual fighting skills. Officer Davis ran your description through the system. Officer Davis, Thomas repeated quietly, the man who had given him the Veterans Center card. He was doing what he thought was right, Wilson said. Once your name flagged in our system, we had to follow up. Thomas crossed his arms. I left that life behind. I have nothing to offer you. Wilson exchanged a look with Ramirez. That's not entirely true, Master Sergeant. Your expertise is still valuable, especially now. What do you mean, especially now? Thomas asked, suspicion clear in his voice. There's a situation, Wilson explained. One that requires someone with your specific background and training. Thomas shook his head. I'm not that person anymore. We thought you might say that, Wilson said, reaching into his jacket. He pulled out a folder and handed it to Thomas. Before you decide, you should know what's at stake. Thomas hesitated before taking the folder. Inside was a single photograph that made his blood run cold. It showed a man Thomas had hoped never to see again. Victor Crane, a former Special Forces operator who had gone rogue years ago. The same man whose operations Thomas had helped shut down in his final mission, the mission that had cost him everything. Crane is back, Wilson said simply. And he's planning something big, something that will cost innocent lives if we don't stop him. Thomas closed the folder, his face unreadable. Why me? You have younger, active operators. Because you know him better than anyone, Ramirez answered. You understand how he thinks, how he operates. And, Wilson added, because he specifically asked for you. Thomas's head snapped up. What? Wilson nodded grimly. He sent a message, said he would only negotiate with Thomas Coleman, said you owe him that much. The words hit Thomas like a physical blow. Memories he had tried to bury for years suddenly flooded back, the mission, the ambush, the choices he had made that day. I can't, Thomas said, his voice barely audible. That part of my life is over. Wilson reached into his pocket again and pulled out a card, different from the one Officer Davis had given him. Take some time to think about it, Wilson said, but not too long. The number on this card is secure. When you're ready to talk, call us. As the two men walked back to their SUV, Thomas stood motionless, a folder in one hand and the card in the other, feeling the walls of his carefully constructed isolation beginning to crumble. Thomas sat alone on a park bench as evening fell, the folder from Director Wilson clutched in his hands. For hours, he had been wrestling with memories he'd spent years trying to forget. The photo of Victor Crane had opened a door in his mind that he had kept firmly locked. The last time Thomas had seen Crane was 8 years ago, during an operation in Eastern Europe. They had been tracking a weapons smuggling network when things went terribly wrong. An ambush. Civilians caught in the crossfire, and choices, terrible choices, that Thomas had been forced to make. He opened the folder again and stared at Crane's face. The man had aged, but his eyes still held the same calculating coldness Thomas remembered. You look troubled, friend. Thomas looked up to see Mike standing nearby, a concerned expression on his face. Mind if I join you? Mike asked. Thomas nodded, closing the folder as Mike sat down. You never called, Mike said, gesturing to the backpack where Thomas kept the phone. Been thinking about it, Thomas admitted. They sat in silence for a moment before Mike spoke again. Something's happened, hasn't it? Thomas turned to look at him. How can you tell? Your eyes, Mike said simply. They look like mine did when my past came knocking. He nodded toward the folder. Bad news? The worst kind, Thomas replied. Someone from my past has resurfaced. Someone dangerous. Mike didn't push for details. Instead, he asked, What are you going to do about it? Thomas sighed heavily. I don't know. For years, I've been running from who I was, what I did. I thought I could just disappear, become invisible. How's that working out for you? Mike asked, no judgment in his voice. Thomas gave a bitter laugh. Not well. Living on the streets, no connections, no purpose. Just surviving day to day. I hear that, Mike nodded. When I came back from Iraq, I couldn't handle normal life anymore. Ended up homeless for 3 years before someone helped me find my way back. Thomas looked at the older biker with new interest. How did you do it? Find your way back? Mike thought for a moment. It wasn't easy. First step was admitting I needed help. Second step was accepting it when it was offered. He paused. Hardest part was forgiving myself for the things I couldn't change. Thomas felt those words hit home. Forgiveness had never been part of his vocabulary, especially self-forgiveness. There's a decision you need to make, Mike observed. I can see it in your face. Thomas nodded. If I step back into that world, I might not like who I become again. But if I don't, innocent people might get hurt. Mike finished for him. Exactly. Mike stood up and stretched. You know, when I was at my lowest, someone told me something I never forgot. They said, your past doesn't define you. Your response to it does. Thomas considered these words as Mike continued. Whatever you did before, whatever mistakes you made, they don't determine who you are now. Only you can decide that. A cool evening breeze rustled the trees around them. In the distance, a child laughed, reminding Thomas of what was at stake. I've been hiding for a long time, Thomas said quietly, telling myself it was better this way, safer for everyone. And now? Mike asked. Thomas took a deep breath. Now I'm not so sure. He stood up, decision forming in his mind. I need to make a call. Mike nodded, understanding. Whatever you decide, you're not alone this time. He pulled a key from his pocket and handed it to Thomas. I've got a spare room above my garage. It's not much, but it's better than sleeping outside. Address is on the back of that phone I gave you. Thomas looked at the key in surprise. Why would you do this for me? Because someone did it for me once, Mike replied. Sometimes, all we need is a safe place to stand while we figure things out. As Mike walked away, Thomas pulled out the phone from his backpack. He turned it over in his hands, then made his decision. He dialed the number on Wilson's card. When the line connected, Thomas spoke with a clarity and purpose he hadn't felt in years. This is Thomas Coleman. Tell Director Wilson I'm in. 24 hours after making that call, Thomas barely recognized himself. He stood in front of a mirror in a secure DIA facility, clean-shaven and dressed in tactical gear that felt strangely familiar against his skin. The homeless man was gone, replaced by someone who looked like a soldier again. It suits you better than those ragged clothes, Director Wilson said, walking into the room. How does it feel? Like putting on an old uniform, Thomas replied, adjusting the tactical vest. Not sure if it still fits. Wilson nodded toward the training room visible through a glass wall. Inside, agents were reviewing maps and photos on large screens. Ready for the briefing? Wilson asked. Thomas took a deep breath. As ready as I'll ever be. They entered the training room where Agent Ramirez and 3 other team members waited. When Thomas walked in, the room fell silent. He could read the doubt in their eyes. They saw a former homeless man, not the decorated soldier he once was. This is Master Sergeant Coleman. Wilson introduced him. He knows our target better than anyone in this room. Thomas approached the main screen showing Victor Crane's photo. What do we know about his current operation? Ramirez stepped forward. 3 days ago, Crane and his team took control of a research facility near the Canadian border. They're holding 12 scientists hostage. Thomas studied the facility layout on another screen. What's so important about this particular facility? Wilson exchanged glances with Ramirez before answering. They're developing a new type of biological agent. Non-lethal, designed for crowd control, but in the wrong hands. It could be modified, Thomas finished. Weaponized. Exactly, Wilson confirmed. Crane has demanded $10 million in safe passage out of the country. He's given us 48 hours before he starts killing hostages. And the part about me? Thomas asked. Ramirez pulled up a video message. Crane's face appeared on screen. Hello, old friend, Crane said with a cold smile. I know you're out there, Thomas. I know they'll find you. And when they do, I want you to be the one who delivers the money. Just you. We have unfinished business. You and I time to finish what we started in Bratislava. Thomas felt the eyes of everyone in the room on him. Bratislava was our last mission together, he explained. Things went wrong. Very wrong. What happened? One of the team members asked. Thomas's jaw tightened. That's classified. All you need to know is that Crane and I were the only survivors, and we both left with scars, some visible, some not. Wilson placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. You don't have to do this. We can find another way. No, Thomas said firmly. Crane wants me because he thinks I'm broken. That living on the streets has made me weak." He straightened his shoulders. "He's wrong." For the next several hours, the team reviewed the assault plan. Thomas offered insights about Crane's tactics, his tendencies, his weaknesses. With each passing minute, he felt more of his old self returning, the strategic thinking, the attention to detail, the calm under pressure. As evening approached, Wilson called for a break. Thomas stepped outside for some air and found himself checking the flip phone Mike had given him. On impulse, he dialed Mike's number. "Thomas?" Mike answered on the second ring. "You okay?" "Yeah," Thomas replied. "I just—" He paused, unsure what to say, and made my decision. "I figured as much when you didn't show up at my place," Mike said. "You're back in, aren't you? Whatever in means for someone like you." Thomas watched the sun setting over the facility. "Something like that." "You worried?" Mike asked. "Not about the mission," Thomas admitted. "I'm worried about after, about who I'll be when this is over." Mike was quiet for a moment. "The fact that you're worried about that tells me something important." "What's that?" "That you're not the same man you were before," Mike said. "The old Thomas wouldn't have cared." As they ended the call, Ramirez approached with a serious expression. "We've got movement at the facility," he said urgently. "Crane's moved up his timeline. We need to go now." Thomas nodded, slipping the phone into his pocket. As he followed Ramirez back inside, he felt a strange sense of calm. For years, he had been running from his past. Now he was walking straight toward it, not as the broken man he had been, but as someone new, someone who had been both a soldier and a survivor. Whatever happened next, Thomas Coleman was finally ready to face it. Dawn broke over the horizon as the assault team approached the research facility. Thomas sat in the lead vehicle, mentally preparing himself for what was to come. The plan was simple but dangerous. Thomas would enter alone, supposedly delivering the ransom money, while the tactical team positioned themselves for a coordinated strike. Wilson's voice came through clearly. "Remember, your primary objective is to locate and secure the hostages. We'll handle Crane and his men." Thomas knew better. This wasn't just about the hostages or the biological agent. This was about finishing something that had started years ago in Bratislava. Something personal. As they neared the facility, Thomas closed his eyes briefly. He thought about the path that had led him here, from decorated soldier to homeless veteran, and now back into the world he had tried to leave behind. The vehicle stopped a half-mile from the facility. "This is where you get out," Ramirez said, handing Thomas a metal briefcase. "The tracking devices and the money are active. We'll be monitoring your position at all times." Thomas took the case and checked his concealed sidearm one last time. "If anything goes wrong." "We'll be right behind you," Wilson assured him. With a nod to the team, Thomas began the lonely walk toward the facility. The morning air was crisp, and each step felt heavy with purpose. Through his earpiece, he could hear the tactical team moving into position. As he approached the main gate, a voice called out from a speaker. "Stop right there, Coleman." Thomas halted, holding up the briefcase for the cameras to see. "I brought what you asked for, Crane," he called out. "Let's talk." The gate buzzed open. Two armed men emerged, their weapons trained on Thomas. "Hands up," one ordered. "Turn around." Thomas complied as they searched him, finding his weapon. "Crane said you'd come armed," the man smirked, taking the gun. "Follow us." They led Thomas into the main building, through sterile corridors that smelled of chemicals and fear. Finally, they reached the central laboratory where Victor Crane waited. Crane looked different from his photo, thinner, with a large scar running down the left side of his face, but his eyes were the same, cold, calculating, dangerous. "Thomas Coleman," Crane said, smiling without warmth. "The mighty soldier, reduced to begging on street corners. Life has not been kind to you, old friend." Thomas set down the briefcase. "I'm not your friend, Victor. Never was." Crane circled Thomas slowly. "Yet here you are, doing what I asked, just like old times." "Where are the hostages?" Thomas demanded. Crane gestured to a reinforced door. "Safe. For now." He pointed to the briefcase. "Open it." Thomas flipped the latches and revealed stacks of cash. "Check it," Crane ordered one of his men. As the man began counting, Thomas scanned the room, noting positions, exits, and threats. just as he'd been trained to do years ago. You know, Crane said conversationally, I've thought about you every day since Bratislava, about what you did, the choices you made. We both made choices that day, Thomas replied evenly. Crane's expression darkened. Yes, but your choices cost me everything. My career, my freedom. This face. He touched his scar. Do you know what it's like to lose everything, Thomas? Thomas thought about the years spent living on the streets, the isolation, the nightmares. Yes, I do. Something in Thomas's voice made Crane pause. He studied Thomas more carefully. Perhaps you do at that. The man checking the money looked up. It's all here, boss. Crane nodded. Good. Now we can proceed with the real business at hand. Through his earpiece, Thomas heard Wilson's voice. Team in position. 30 seconds. What real business? Thomas asked, buying time. Crane smiled coldly. Did you really think this was about money, or even those scientists? He leaned closer. This was always about getting you here. Face to face. Thomas tensed as Crane reached inside his jacket, but instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small photo, the same one Thomas kept in his backpack, the one of his family. I found this in your things after Bratislava, Crane said. Kept it all these years, knowing someday I'd return it to you, when you were ready to hear the truth. What truth? Thomas asked, confusion mixing with suspicion. Crane's eyes held something Thomas had never seen in them before, not hatred, but something almost like compassion. They didn't die in that car accident, Thomas, Crane said quietly. That was the cover story they gave you. The truth is. A loud explosion cut him off as the tactical team breached the facility. Smoke filled the room, and chaos erupted. Gunfire. Shouting. Through the confusion, Thomas saw Crane running toward a side exit. Without hesitation, Thomas followed, not for revenge or duty, but for something he hadn't felt in years. Hope.